Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, RB Laws, and this is my co-host.
Christopher Wells.
We appreciate all the support on our recent content, and before we do get started, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates.
Yes, so since the last time we recorded, we had some series that have ended, and we still have another Game 7 that's going to be going on. By the time that you'll see this, that Game 7 will have ended, and we'll talk about that, in the next episode. But got some other series to discuss. So I think we'll start with the Western Conference one, right? And we got Nuggets Clippers, with the Nuggets ending up blowing the door off the Clippers in Game 7, 120 to 101, and it wasn't really that close for most of the second half, right? I think Ty Lue, he emptied the bench and the reserve guys came in and kind of cleaned up the final margin. But really, when you look at this Game 7, this is kind of like an ideal type of Game 7 that you want to have if you're Denver, where it's not just Jokic and Murray backpacking. And they had decent games, right? They wasn't necessarily the quote unquote best games, right? But they were still really good. And Jokic defensively made some big plays, 3 steals, a big block on Zubac, right? Murray, 5 rebounds, 2 assists, block as well, right? 7 of 15 from the field. But this was kind of a all-around team effort on both ends of the floor. You got a lot of really balanced contributions from pretty much everybody who got minutes, right? Because even after Jokic and Murray's combined 32, you got 21 from Christian Brown, you got 22 from Aaron Gordon, you got 15 from Michael Porter Jr., you got 16 off the bench for Westbrook, and that's kind of been a key thing where, he's basically outplayed the Clippers bench, right? And the Clippers second unit or bench guys were supposed to kind of be the difference in this series, right? Because most people felt like both starting fives were good, but it felt like the Clippers may have had more additional guys to work with. But for the Nuggets, it's just pretty impressive series win. I know obviously this was kind of looked at as a coin flip series. We had the Nuggets winning this in 7, but there were several points in this series where it kind of felt like things weren't going their way, right? Where they were down 2-1 to the Nuggets or to the Clippers, and they got blown out in Game 3, right after a couple of initially close games, but they battled back, withstood the punch from the Clippers in Game 4, right? And then, kind of just cruise control by and large from there. But either way, this was kind of the type of performance that you'd want to see if you're the Nuggets and you picked them to win the series, because you're looking at it just from the perspective of it's a championship core, right? These guys have been together for a while. There's, a couple of guys that have more outsized roles like Christian Brown and Peyton Watson. And then also Russ, right? Because again, he's a guy where he was being left open, right? A ton of shots where, the defense is giving him those shots and he's making them pay. And he's still finding other ways to be effective on, defensively, right? Getting steals and, getting extra possessions in terms of rebounding. So he's been super impactful in this series and has been like kind of one of the big differences for them. And then, when you look at it from a Clippers perspective, just kind of tough, right? Because obviously they dealt with, the injuries, to Kawhi earlier in the season where he wasn't available. They weathered the storm with a bunch of their other guys, right? They ended up winning 50 games, played really well the last couple months of the season. And then in the playoffs, it just kind of felt like the same song and dance. It was still a hard-fought series because it went 7. But it's still kind of disappointing that by the end of the series, right, it felt like the Clippers just kind of, I don't like using the word quit, but it just kind of felt like once they got that punch early on in the game, they just didn't really have an answer for it, right? Harden no-show, 13 assists, which is good, but only 7 points. And it's like his playoff numbers, by and large, are fine, but like the issue has been like in a lot of these big games where you really need him, he doesn't show up. You also got nothing from Norman Powell. I mean, you were down by 30, so it's like a good Harden game. You still would have probably lost the game because you just didn't get enough from most of the supporting cast, really from anyone. Even Kawhi was solid in this game, but, hadn't really been as dominant as he was in the earlier portion of the series. And that just kind of comes down to, I think, with the Nuggets, it's funny because so many of the issues they had in the regular season, like the lack of defense, the lack of depth, the issues in terms of the lack of volume with perimeter shooting, you got a lot of that. And sometimes in the playoffs, sometimes some of these series will come down to, some guys knocking down their shots. Because say, like from the Clippers' perspective, guys like Chris Dunn and Derek Jones Jr., that's kind of their versions of Russ. It's a little bit different, right? But like those guys are left open and they have to capitalize on the opportunities they were given, and they couldn't really do that. And then once they became less playable, then you run into the issue of not having a whole lot of athleticism to match up against Denver's, front line. I know Jokic isn't a crazy athlete, but like Gordon is a good athlete. Brown runs the floor. Russ is still a really good athlete. So, overall, really quality team win for the Nuggets, right? And obviously now they're going to have a different challenge in OKC. But for the Clippers, what do you do? Because you did have a good regular season. Little bit of a disappointment in the playoffs. Not too bad because again it was a 7-game series, right? And you were the lower seed. But you also kind of look at it as from like how much better can they realistically be? Maybe you could bank on Kawhi being healthy, right? And then going from there, but you don't really have an additional young piece that you can say like, all right, this guy's going to get better and help get us over the top. Some of the depth pieces, like I said, just were a little bit underwhelming. So I don't know because like I don't think they're gonna blow it up. Like I think they just probably bring back Harden and just run it back and see where it goes. I just don't know how much better they can realistically be. Like they can still clearly we wrote them off as a regular season team and that was wrong, right? Like they're still gonna be a good team. I just don't. It just kind of feels like the window's probably closed at this point because you still have to factor in Harden and Kawhi being another year older, and it just you felt like you just got to, like Powell wasn't quite as consistent in this series to kind of offset what you sometimes didn't get from Harden, even though he had his moments as well. But just as a whole, I don't know. It just feels like a team that is probably just going to be slightly worse like year after year and then just probably just kind of just phase out. But I could be wrong, but this is kind of one of the reasons why we didn't pick the Clippers because we've kind of seen this before, right? Where they'll have strong regular seasons followed by a postseason that just feels a little underwhelming. And I'm not saying this is quite the same as those because you got a healthy postseason series from Kawhi, which you haven't gotten in a very long time. But that's it's like at a certain point you can only be fooled so many times. I feel like where that's kind of the main reason why we lean towards Denver, even with their situation this year, because you couldn't blame anybody for picking the Clippers either because of the fact that you look at Denver and it's like they fired their coach and their GM. They looked awful defensively for long stretches this season, and they got like 6 guys. So, this one truly was a coin flip one, and I didn't really expect a blowout. I think we both thought the Nuggets would win, but I think we kind of felt like it'd be more competitive. But I don't know, the Clippers kind of quitting on this game pretty early just felt really disappointing because outside of the first quarter, really, you got really nothing else in terms of a competitive game.
Yeah, that was my number one gripe was, as good as it feels to be right about this, series and in our prediction and stuff like that, I still don't feel like super happy about it because it wasn't, a super entertaining game where, you look at it and the final score really isn't even indicative of what the heck went on in the game. And like you said, after the first quarter, you pretty much could tell that the game was over. The Clippers had no life. I didn't like anything that they did offensively. James Harden in a game 7 having only 8 shots, I think that pisses me off, number one, because I think, you're the second option, throughout the whole season and really even the primary option when Kawhi was out. And you only took 8 shots, and there's a bunch of guys that had more than you, like Derek Jones Jr., Norman Powell. I feel like that's telling, I think, of what the mindset was coming into this game. And I don't know, the Nuggets, they squeezed by. They got lucky in a couple of games, but that's kind of the way that the Nuggets, operate. They kind of win these games when you don't really think that they can, backed by some clutch performances. But in this one, they didn't even really need their, magic. They just kind of, willed themselves to the win, like you talked about with the, overall team performance and stuff like that, where you didn't even have like a crazy Jokic game. You didn't have a crazy Jamal Murray game. Definitely more of a team effort, which is good. Like, and I think if you're Denver, this is the best case scenario because you didn't really have to, go out there and exert too much energy, because the Clippers didn't really put up a freaking fight. Like, I think the bench guys came in and then they had to put the starters back in or whatever. It was just very weird game from the Clippers offensively and defensively as well. They couldn't really stop anybody, any of the role players. And that's kind of what game
Yeah.
sevens do come down to, especially, for the home team. You're kind of banking on either great performances from your superstars, or you might be looking at some great performances and well-rounded performances from, your role players. And that's kind of exactly what happened here with the role players part. At home, they knew how to close it out. And they've been here before. They've been in this situation as well. So I think that experience helped them as well. But I mean, you look at it, you did a good job defensively on Jokic this game. You did a solid job, I think, defensively on Jamal Murray, but you just couldn't do anything else against the other guys. And I think that's a big problem. And I don't know where the Clippers go from here. Like you said, I think they run it back. I think they at very least will be able to be a solid regular season team, but it continues, and like you said, that's one of the reasons why we didn't pick them. We didn't really trust this team to be able to, get over the hump. I feel like, especially if it came down to 7 games, I just didn't trust Harden enough. And, lo and behold, unfortunately, James Harden did have a stinker. And I don't think you can blame it all on him, because the game definitely was not all on him. As a team,
Right.
I didn't even really like what they were doing offensively, scheme wise, where, Derrick Jones Jr. has the ball a lot in his hands, a lot of shots, more than Kawhi. And Kawhi's in the corner. I'm like, guys, what are we doing? You know what I mean? I feel like in a game
Yeah.
7, Kawhi and James Harden should be balling out, or at least attempting to. Like, they should have 50 shots between the two of them, respectfully, and they didn't even get close to that amount. So that's concerning, I think. And I don't know where the effort level was. I don't know mentally where that team was. But if you pick the Clippers, I feel really bad for you. But if you pick the Nuggets, this is exactly what I think, people expected.
Yeah, exactly. Because like just overall, the level of attention to detail and focus was there from
Yeah,
the jump. I mean, the Clippers had like an early lead, and then it was just such a quick turnaround
sure.
where the Nuggets just kind of turned on, or flipped the switch, and kind of exerted, a lot on both ends of the floor. But like the offense, definitely like was on point for them. Where
Mm-hmm.
just every shot they put up was going in, and over 50 from the field, almost 40 from three. Just like a like a great. I mean, you put up 120 in an elimination game, right?
Mm-hmm.
A do or die elimination game. Because we've seen a lot of game sevens where they're low scoring, they're really ugly, and it kind of comes down to certain moments. But just a complete game from the Nuggets, from pretty much from start to finish, and for the Clippers, pretty much another dud.
Yeah, very unfortunate.
Yeah. So now for the Nuggets, now you're moving on to the second round playing the Oklahoma City Thunder, right? That's the team in the Western Conference that won 68 games. If you take the playoffs as well, there's 72 and 14 so far in the season, right? And they got obviously the league's best defense and still like a top tier offense, right? One of the best offensive teams in the league as well. This is a tough one, I think, for Denver, just because you had to grind out a 7-game series against a team that's pretty close to being even, right? Whereas the Thunder, we know that at least record-wise and numbers-wise, they're the better team. They got more depth, and they have some issues in terms of a lot of physical, long, athletic guys to throw on the Nuggets' perimeter guys. I don't know how much size and physicality they'll have for, say like Gordon and Jokic. Like it kind of feels like those guys will probably still continue to, I think Jokic can have a better offensive series than he did against the Clippers because there's no Zubac that you're necessarily, worried about kind of being able to match you on both ends of the floor
Mm-hmm.
physically. But, can Murray still have a strong series against Oklahoma City, right? Can Michael Porter Jr. continue to play well? Can Russell Westbrook continue to knock down the shots that Oklahoma City's going to give him? And that's where, those are the questions for Denver. And then for Oklahoma City, continues to still be everybody outside of SGA. Can you trust them to, continue to make plays on both ends of the floor? Because we know defensively they can do it, but they're going to have guys that are going to be left open too, right? Guys like Lou Dort, Caruso, and others. Can Jalen Williams continue to play well? He played really well in the first round, but Denver's a different team, right? A little bit more of a serious team than the Grizzlies. Even though, like, wings wise, you don't really feel like they have like a ton of wings, but like you could have Gordon on Jalen Williams, or maybe they try Christian Brown, but he's probably going to be going against SGA. I don't know. I mean, I think the games will be competitive, but right now I'm still kind of leaning towards Oklahoma City in 5. I mean, I think it could go longer for sure because I do think in the regular season, and sometimes it's tough to factor in those regular season matchups, but I think you can see there are ways that Denver can stretch Oklahoma City offensively, where, again, guys like Jokic and Gordon can kind of overpower some of the OKC guys in the post, right? And, I think, for Denver, their offense can kind of start from there. And then obviously if they get hot, that can be a problem. But I don't know. I just feel like for OKC, I think they have the personnel to slow down a lot of the supporting cast for Denver. And, I think, in a 7-game playoff series, I think that might be the difference there.
Yeah, I agree. I think it comes down to two things, right? I think for Oklahoma City, obviously, spoiler, I'm picking them in about 5 or 6, so along the same lines as you, probably 5. But for Oklahoma City, it comes down to two things. Number one is taking Jamal Murray out of the game. I think they have the perimeter personnel to do that, and we already know that that's the recipe to success, to beating the Nuggets, where it's like we already know that Jokic is probably going to average like a triple-double in this series. That's what I think. Because like you said, Oklahoma City doesn't have that Zubac kind of guy that's like, a physical guy that will bother Jokic as much.
But they got Hartenstein, they got double bigs, but it's still different.
But it's very different than what Zubac, was able to do in the Clippers series. So, that's where I expect Jokic to kind of have his way. However, those numbers aren't going to matter if nobody else shows up. And I think they know that, and they know that the key is going to be limiting and taking out Jamal Murray and, trying to put the pressure on other guys to show up like a Michael Porter Jr., Aaron Gordon, Christian Brown, and Russell Westbrook. What are those guys going to look like versus the supporting cast of Oklahoma City? And the second part and the second key to victory for them is going to be Jalen Williams. I think, J-Dub, he has to show up. He has to pop off. And I think, he's going to be the key piece alongside Chet, too, I think on both ends, because Chet has to show up defensively and offensively. You talked about it in the live stream that we did yesterday. Please go and check that out. It is under our live section under our YouTube channel. But, you were talking about he has to continue to hit his threes. Yeah, if he can be a 40% three-point shooter throughout the entire series, that's literally all they need, to be quite honest, because they're going to be stretching the floor, playing, 4 out, 1 in, and I think that's going to be, a tough cover. And Hartenstein, he's going to be in the paint, and he has the floater game as well, and Jokic isn't a good rim protector, so I think there's a pathway for Oklahoma City to actually potentially even sweep. I'm not going to go that far, but I think there's a lot of things that are kind of, they don't match up. Denver doesn't match up that well with Oklahoma City, I feel like, especially on that perimeter area where, those defenders are going to be hounding Jamal Murray. And we kind of saw that, I think, what was it, last year? Minnesota versus Denver.
Yeah.
Jamal Murray, he couldn't really do a whole lot. There were times when he was pretty much put in a straitjacket, although that series did go to, Game 7 or whatever, but
with a second half collapse from Denver.
Yeah, meltdown, huge meltdown. Still not over that, by the way. But, I feel like Oklahoma City, they have personnel similar to, what Minnesota had that year with Nickeil Alexander-Walker and Jaden McDaniels. Those are pretty long perimeter defenders, and I think Thunder can replicate that, and I think Jamal Murray is going to have a tough series, and that's probably going to lead to their demise.
Yeah, I mean, and that's really the question is, like, OKC, the defense, does it still continue to be, stifling? And like I said, then it just comes down to some of these other guys offensively. Because, again, just like Denver, they're going to have guys that they're not going to be guarding quite as much. And that's going to be a big part, of the series. And like I said, that two big lineup, I'm curious to see. Because, you can afford to not always have Chet this time guard the center. Like, he doesn't always have to guard Jokic. Now he can roam. And he can, deter other guys around the basket. And he's got to stay out of foul trouble, right? Because of guys like Gordon and Jokic, those are big physical guys. And, there's a potential for, him to pick up some tough fouls against those guys. And if he gets into foul trouble, I think it's going to get difficult for Oklahoma City. Because then it's just Hartenstein, which, again, he's good. Don't get me wrong. But like you said, it can't just be the SGA show. You're going to have both J-Dub and Chet show up on both ends of the floor because those guys have tools defensively as well, even SGA defensively, right? I'm sure like you can get away with some stretches where he could guard Murray, not the whole game, but I think you could, at times feel okay with putting him on him for stretches if you needed to, if the other guys can show up. And like I said, just for OKC, I just think they have a few more guys, right? Like they've been playing 8, 9, 10
Yeah,
guys,
10.
in these games. Whereas, with Denver, it's really just 6 guys. Those 6 guys are good, but, if any one of them get to the point where they're having a tough night, you don't really have anybody else that you can really put in there. I mean, like Peyton Watson is kind of the other guy, right? Where like maybe if he can kind of knock down some shots, get out in transition, block some shots, and get some stops, he could be another key piece because that can give Denver an extra defensive body. But really, no one else. I mean, DeAndre Jordan, maybe he gets in there, but he hasn't really done a whole lot. I mean, and he really can at this point. You can't really ask him to do
No.
a ton. So that's what I think it's going to come down to.
Heck yeah.
But I would be surprised if Oklahoma City lost the series.
Oh, yeah. That would be horrible.
Yeah, like I have OKC winning in 5, but I think Denver can extend it. But I don't think Denver will win this series. But we'll see.
I agree.
And then moving on to the Eastern Conference, right? We did have an elimination game the last time we recorded because we had a couple of games that were going on while we were recording, and that was the Knicks beating the Detroit Pistons right in Game 6. Nail biter. It was a game where the Knicks were down in the fourth quarter and then had a strong close led by Jalen Brunson to end that game. Of course, Brunson hit the game-winning or go-ahead shot right against Ausar Thompson, who was kind of subbed in and out late in the fourth quarter for whatever reason. But the Knicks ended up closing it out, right, kind of in the way that you kind of thought, right? And we picked them to win in 6. It ended up being 6. Could have been 7. Could have lost the series potentially, depending on a couple of scenarios. But just as a whole, thank you. We'll start from the Knicks' perspective. I think what's been a little strange about this series is that it feels like offensively you're not getting quite as much as I think you would have expected from the team as a whole. Like, you'll have games where like guys are kind of in and out of there. And like this game, it wasn't just Brunson, but it just feels like these long stretches where the Knicks can't get things going. And, you kind of have to have Brunson bail you out. Obviously, Towns in this game had, 15 rebounds and a couple steals, but he was in foul trouble. He fouled out and had 10 points and was 4 for 10. But you did get 25 from Bridges. You got 22 from Anunoby. You got 13 from Hart. Basically nothing from the bench. But I don't know. It's just kind of weird because, the Knicks won this in 6, but it felt like there were a lot of games where they were kind of on thin ice and kind of just, eked out a win kind of by, the hair on their chins. And, that's where you give credit to Detroit for making it a tough competitive series, right? Because, they had a couple of games that were basically coin flips, right? But the reason why we picked the Knicks to win the series was because they have a little bit more that they can go to than Detroit can, at the end of games. Because, you're banking on Cade, right? First time in the playoffs, right? What can he do? He was 0 for 8 from 3. But, all in all, I think you saw a lot of positives from him in terms of clearly being a guy going forward. But the the Pistons 3-point shooting just did not show up for most of the series, right? And that was kind of what this came down to. And, if you're the Pistons, again, I think you feel good. You had a really good regular season, a great historical turnaround, right? And you did all this with Jaden Ivey being out for the second half of the season. And he showed some progress in terms of his development before he got hurt, had the untimely leg injury. So, I think if you're the Pistons, I think you got to feel good about, this series where, you go in, you're playing with house money, you're not expected to win, but you gave the Knicks a tough competitive series, more so than I think what a lot of people were expecting. And then you just kind of continue with the development of your young guys, and then you go from there. Maybe you swap out a couple of, vets, who knows. But either way, I think you feel good. But then from the Knicks' perspective, now they move on, to the second round to face Boston. But before we do that, you can kind of give me your thoughts about, this game in this series. Because it felt like the Knicks were going to lose the game before Brunson was able to kick it into high gear and save them, which, he's going to have to do for different games and for some of these series. He had 40, and he's been battling through an ankle injury too. So super impressive stuff from him.
Yeah, I haven't been super impressed, with the Knicks as a whole. I think with Brunson, obviously, yeah, I've loved every minute of basketball that I've seen from him in the playoffs thus far. But as a unit and as a whole, they haven't really been the team that I thought they were going to be coming into the season, number one. And also, they haven't really been the team that they were in the regular season. Like you talked about, offensively, the struggles have mounted. Maybe you give, Detroit a lot of credit defensively because they do have some awesome studs on the defensive end, and they've actually did a great job, I thought, of game planning and figuring out a way to stop Karl Anthony Towns, because I think that's what it comes down to. Because we already know the Brunson show is going to go on no matter what, but if you can limit Towns, I think that shakes things up for the Knicks offensively, and that's where I think where the struggles come from, because then you're relying on the wings and Josh Hart, and I think that's not necessarily the most old reliable option. I feel like you'd rather go to that two-man game that was so special throughout the season, but in this series they got the job done. It doesn't really matter how they did it; they just did it. At this point, I feel like that's kind of the mindset that a lot of Knicks fans have. They're on very, very thin ice here, I believe, because through round one, didn't really get a lot of play from your bench. You have Mitchell Robinson who comes in. His minutes I think are very good because he's on the glass. He's rim protecting, things like that. Cam Payne kind of just up and down. Same thing with Deuce McBride. Those guys, I think they have to be, spark plugs going forward, but I don't know how reliable they're going to be, in the next series. But throughout this series, I wasn't super impressed with them. They hit timely shots, of course, but definitely not, super duper deep team here. We're talking, they pretty much play their starters a lot. And if those guys absolutely need a breather, like, then they're going to come out. But otherwise, they're pretty much playing the whole game. And I think that is only going to get you but so far. But, congrats to them, because I think, like we talked about, it wasn't really, I think, as dominating as people wanted it to be, especially if you did pick the Knicks. I feel like you probably could have gotten Detroit out of the way a little bit sooner just because of the lack of experience from, their superstar like Cade Cunningham. But at the end of the day, you have to credit the vets for keeping them in the game. You have to credit Cade for having, I think, a pretty solid playoff debut. There were times when, he was pretty much the only reason that they won those games. But overall, like you said, Detroit, they had a good season, so you have to give them a pat on the back for sure, because nobody expected them to be here. I don't think I had that on my bingo card of Detroit being a playoff team, especially, not having to go through the play-in. If somebody would have told me that they got into the playoffs via the play-in, I would have believed it. But if you would have told me that they were going to be the 6th seed, I would have been like, yeah, no shot. But shout out to them, because they've had some great, off-season development, internal development. They had great veterans come in and really show us, what a serious team built around Cade looks like, and that's, I think, all you can ask for. But yeah, the Knicks, we got to see what happens in round 2.
Yeah, and now we'll get into that. So they're gonna be playing the Boston Celtics, right? Defending champions in the second round. Obviously, the Celtics have home court; they're the 2 seed. But what are we thinking? Because obviously, in the regular season, you can always take it with a grain of salt. But we know that the Celtics in the regular season won every game, all 4 matchups, regardless of who was in or out. Because I think there were some non-Porzingis games, there were some non-Drew Holiday games. And it didn't matter, right? The Celtics were able to kind of just have the way. Jason Tatum, right, in that series, or in that regular season series, went off. He had some of his best games of the regular season, right, against the New York Knicks, right? In terms of his splits, against them, against the New York Knicks, he put up basically 34, 7, and 7, right? So, I mean, on 69 true shooting percentage. So essentially, yeah, like that, were some of his best games of the regular season. Because, in terms of the wings for the Knicks, obviously we know, like, OG Anunoby, he's awesome defensively. Bridges has been a little bit of a letdown defensively, I think, considering what you were expecting of him. But you just kind of felt like going into the season, the argument for the Knicks is the matchup is closer, right, to being able to kind of contend with what the Celtics can throw at you. But it's just the problem is that the Celtics on both ends of the floor, I think, have more guys. And I think, for the tough part is for the Knicks, where are some of these guys going to be able to hide, right? You're not going to be able to get away with, taking some of their guys and kind of saying like, all right, we can put you on, a guy that's not really a guy that can space the floor at all, right? Or a guy who's not really a true threat offensively, because the Celtics don't really have that, right? Pretty much everybody in their rotation is a threat on both ends of the floor. Now, for the Celtics, they're a little banged up, right? Holiday missed some of the games in the previous series, right? Jaylen Brown's coming off of a knee thing. I guess Tatum had his wrist injury, even though he played well. So, there's an element of that there. But I think it's going to be really difficult for the Knicks to be able to win the series. I think there's at least the potential for it to be closer, right, than it might have been like in the regular season, right? Because I think, the Knicks could be a little better in some of these situations. So I added a Celtics in 6, but I think it could potentially get really ugly for the Knicks if, the Celtics go back to getting really hot from 3, because in the first round matchup against the Magic, right, the Magic were kind of able to slow down a lot of the Celtics perimeter offense, right? In terms of that season series, and some of it's a little bit skewed, I guess, because of the last couple of games. But like, they shot 38% from 3 as a team. But like I said, that's that last game, right, where they just destroyed them, right, was a little bit different, right? Because in some of those other games, they didn't shoot very well, from 3. And that's kind of a big thing there is, can the Knicks limit their 3-point attempts, right? Because we know the Celtics, in terms of their 3-point shooting attempts, right? They were ridiculous in terms of the volume, right? But the Magic were at least able to keep them in check, a little bit, in terms of they only got off but so many. But, for the Knicks, I don't think they can necessarily do that. And, again, if the supporting cast for the Celtics beyond just Tatum and Brown continue to show up and do their thing, and Porzingis also has a good series, I don't know. I think this is going to be tough because, the Knicks, in terms of the odds makers, they're severe underdogs, right? Despite the fact that, it's a 2 and a 3 matchup. But I don't know. I'd be surprised if the Knicks won the series. And I think I will give the Knicks at least like the benefit of the doubt that I think they could steal a couple of games. But I'd be surprised if it goes beyond that. And I think there's a lot more potential for the Celtics to end this quickly than for the Knicks to end it quickly.
Yeah, I'm gonna go with the Knicks in 6. I gotta defend my,
Yeah,
my
defend
initial
it.
pick. With
Mhm.
the Knicks winning the finals going into the season. It's gonna be tough. There is a blueprint. However, like I said, it's gonna be very, very difficult. I think, and it's probably not the most ultra realistic, but I think it's gonna happen. The team has a lot of grit. They have, I think, some physical pieces to do what Orlando was doing a little bit to Boston, because I think you could tell if you watched, the majority of that series, that wasn't really the Boston from last year. I think it was a elevated version of Tatum. However,
Mhm.
because
Right.
that it was the complete Tatum takeover. But you look at the other guys, and I feel like from what I saw, Orlando did a good job. Kind of throwing, I guess, some wrenches in the gears, to make that, because we already know how Boston's system works. They rely heavily on the 3-pointer, and I feel like if they can find a way to, take that away from them, like Orlando did a little bit, especially from the guys other than Tatum, I think there's a potential for them to kind of throw a wrench in the whole series, because we already know that. Like I said, they generate so many 3-point looks, and I think the Knicks, they do have the perimeter personnel to kind of make that difficult. Like, I want to see OG Anunoby pretty much glued to Jason Tatum the entire series, kind of like what they did with against Detroit with Cade Cunningham, because there were times when, like I said, Cade looked amazing and credit his talent, but there were also times when the possessions didn't look too good, and that was because OG Anunoby was all in the mix, and the Knicks were playing some great team defense, and I think that trend needs to continue, because we already know the offensive firepower is definitely there. They have that with the 2-man game of Jalen Brunson and Karl-Anthony Towns. Towns really just has to show up. That's all that really that 2-man game comes down to, because we already know that Brunson's going to get his, things of that nature, right? And, I feel like you probably have to put Mikal Bridges on Jaylen Brown, probably
Mhm.
Josh Hart on Derek White, Brunson on Holiday, because I feel like Holiday is probably the guy that has, the least offensive firepower. And I think you can probably potentially get away with Jalen Brunson being there and kind of trying to stick to that. However, we already know that Boston is going to hunt him. But there's a way that they can mitigate that by being physical and kind of just not letting Boston generate those open threes. And I think, you need to be aggressive. You need to have the grit that the team has shown throughout the regular season. And I know a lot of people are going to be like, well, the Knicks didn't even beat the Celtics in the regular season. Like I said on stream last night, I've learned the hard way, and I think you and I have both learned the hard way, that regular
Right.
season matchups sometimes don't even matter. So with those, they're going in one ear and out the other because of what happened last year when we did pick the Phoenix Suns to beat Minnesota, when indeed they got swept. Although they had done a great job against Minnesota throughout the regular season. So I feel like I'm not going to go with the Celtics here. I think the Knicks will win it in 6. I think, there are times when I think they match up well. And coming into the season, I thought that their clear design of the team and construction was to pretty much match Boston, right? You have
Mhm.
some solid wings that are all around guys and can do stuff on both ends of the floor. You have an offensive guy like Jalen Brunson. Then you have Towns to be that 5-out kind of, big man similar to Porzingis. So that's going to be key. I think the only area that, worries me the most about the Celtics is going to be the bench and the depth pieces because you already talked about it. You have so many guys coming off the bench who are going to give you guaranteed buckets, right? And then you look at New York, you don't really have that. You have guys that can give you buckets, but not guaranteed, right? You have Cam Payne, you have Deuce McBride. Those guys need to show up because they practically didn't really give you a whole lot throughout the Pistons series. There were times when, give you like a quick 6 points, but I think you need more than that if you're really going to contend against Boston. So those guys need to show up as well. And I think Mitchell Robinson's job is going to be that physical rim protecting rebounder. And I think they have to be aggressive on the glass, limit second chance opportunities, and don't give up kick out threes. Because if they do that, then they're going to lose the series off rip. It might actually end up being a sweep if that's the trend.
Yeah, that's the question, from there, because with the Celtics, they feel really comfortable switching everything defensively, right? And they can kind of find ways to be like, well, we don't even have to have Tatum or Brown always guard Brunson. We can, rely on the backcourt, and their jobs offensively are a lot different than Tatum and Brown, so they can get away with, not being able to, you know, like kind of, I guess, extend or expend energy from their stars in
Sure.
order to, kind of do that. Whereas I mean, you can't really. I mean, I guess you could say like with the Knicks, like their best defenders aren't their best players for sure. But you don't want Brunson, or Towns switched on to guys guarding other guys, right? Because that's not really what they do as much, right? Like you're perfectly fine with Tatum and Brown doing that, and then Tatum, can he continue to knock down shots, rebounding? We know, he can do a little bit of everything, or not a little. He can do a lot of everything, right? So, he's going to be, kind of the big factor, right? Where it doesn't feel like the Knicks have much of an answer for him. And then, again, even guys off the bench like Horford, he could be a key piece because can he stick with a guy like Jalen Brunson and switches? Because he's had moments defensively, in the last couple seasons, right, where you can kind of get away with him being on a guy out in the perimeter if it's not like a blow by guy.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's other situations where, Brunson, because he's not really beating you as much with quickness. It's a lot more in terms of the strength. But because he's such a great, pull up guy, that's kind of the issue in terms of like you can't really go with drop necessarily, right? Because he can kind of hurt you there. And then, like you said, the 2-man game, Towns is the swing guy because if he has a big series, right, then that's going to, allow him to continue to stay on the floor, even if there's some issues defensively,
Yeah.
right? And Porzingis, that's another key guy, right? Because he's the guy that's going to be roaming the middle for, for Boston, right? And he's been a guy that we haven't really seen a whole lot of in the postseason for the Celtics because he, barely played for them in the playoffs last year, right? Because he
Mm-hmm.
played, in the first round and got hurt and didn't come back until the finals, and even then didn't play a ton in those games either, right? And we didn't get to see a lot of him in the regular season against the Knicks either. I think he played 2 games. So I just think the Celtics have a lot more that they can work with in terms of the personnel and in terms of the scheme. And I think for the Knicks, if the offense is kind of what we saw against Detroit, I don't think they're going to be able to win. I think they're going to have to make sure that the offense is, pretty even in terms of everybody contributing in some way, shape, or form on the offensive end. However they can do it, right? Like Hart, can he get the rebounds and push the ball up the floor and give him some transition offense, right?
Yeah.
Can Brunson and or can Bridges and Anunoby, can they be guys, who can, knock down timely shots? Because Anunoby doesn't have as many, strength areas that he can kind of leverage against this Celtics team. But we know he can still attack closeouts and he can, certainly hit spot up jumpers.
I feel like
But
Bridges has to be the guy to average like 20 plus alongside, those other guys, which might not be realistic, but it could be it could be possible because I feel like OG's probably not going to pop off on the offensive end if he's going to be
right.
guarding Tatum 24/7.
Without the bench, you can't have anybody in the key group for the Knicks play, you know, average or below average. Like
Yeah.
you can't really get away with that. Like
Mhm.
say for the Knicks, you could say, okay, maybe Holiday doesn't play great, but then literally everybody else does, and then it's perfectly fine or something like that. You know what I mean? Like, just I think the Celtics have a lot more to go to, but I think it can definitely be a fun series for sure. It's like I would like for it to be a longer, more competitive series because again, most people expected the Knicks to be a real challenger for the Celtics this season, right? And then for the Celtics, obviously, there's been so many rumors now about maybe potentially they're going to be forced to break up their team. So obviously, this is kind of, I'm not saying this is a last hurrah for them, but it could be potentially where it's like, this could be it, right? In terms of a couple of their other guys that they may not feel that they can, continue to run with. Like say a guy like a Drew Holiday, because of his age and his contract, he could be, a guy that might be on the way out if he has kind of an underwhelming postseason, right? Or, maybe they move on from somebody else. We don't know. But obviously there's a lot to kind of look out, from that perspective as well. Because at least
Yeah.
for the Knicks, like say if they go out in the second round, like that would obviously be a disappointment because they went out in the second round last year and you made these moves to improve. But I guess you could also look at like from the Knicks, like if it doesn't work out, they could possibly swap out some guys. Maybe they get some other star. Who knows, right?
Hmm.
But the Celtics, it's a little bit different. But I think the Celtics are going to win the series.
Yeah, I get you.
Then moving on, another matchup that's going to be taking place and will have already started by the time this episode comes out. Pacers Cavs, right? Obviously, this is going to be another big matchup because of the fact that the Pacers ended up beating the Bucks in the first round, right? Obviously, you didn't have you didn't have Lillard in some of those games, but the Pacers kind of showcased why most people felt like they were the favorites to win. Just kind of a strength in numbers combination of a lot of depth, improved defense, right? And just, there's so many guys that you can kind of turn to. But now they're going to face, I think, a much tougher test in terms of the Cavs because the Cavs offensively, I think, can offer a lot more terror than I think the Bucks can. Because with the Bucks, it's kind of just Giannis, and then you have to hope and pray that their other shooters get hot, right? Like it took, Gary Trent Jr. having 2 30-plus point games for them to be remotely competitive. Obviously, with a diminished version of Dame. So with the Cavs, it's a little bit different because they have a lot more guys that they can turn to, even guys off the bench, right? Beyond the starting five, right? Obviously, we know they have perimeter shooting, but then you also have the factor of the two bigs, right? And those are the guys where, if they can kind of continue to play as well as they've played so far, I think that's going to be really tough for Indiana because then you can play inside and outside, right? Those are the guys that offensively are a little bit more limited than some of the other guys like the backcourt for Cleveland. And then obviously you have the bench guys, DeAndre Hunter and Ty Jerome, and that's going to be a key piece. And then for the Cavs, obviously the Pacers are very different from the Heat because it's just a significantly better team on both ends of the floor, but especially offensively, right? Like they have a ton of guys that they can put out there that can attack the Cavs. Maybe in certain ways, right? Can we see certain matchups where it's like Jared Allen, right? What does he do guarding a stretch five and Miles Turner? Mobley, can he continue to kind of be the defensive presence that he's been over the course of the season? What are we going to get from Garland? Because he's got a foot toe issue going on. As of this moment, we're recording before game one starts. Supposedly, he has not gone through his warm up, so it's possible he may not play. I don't know, right? Because we still have a little bit of time before that happens. But obviously, that's going to be a key factor as well, right? Can the backcourt for Cleveland continue to supply the juice offensively? So I think if the Cavs continue to do what they've been doing, and if you continue to get the improved play from their front court as well as the bench guys, I think it's going to be a really tough series for the Pacers. I think offensively, there's going to be games where the Pacers can get hot, and you're going to get some strong performances from a bunch of guys. But some of those guys, I think it might be a tough matchup. Like, say, Siakam and Turner, right? You got to contain that Pacers front court. And you also have to deter some of the drives from guys like Mitchell and Garland, right? Because we know that those guys, especially Mitchell, can live at the rim at different points. And then, for the bench guys, right? Are you going to get some good contributions from, Obi Toppin on both ends of the floor, right? TJ McConnell, can he find maybe some ways to be, continue to be, a pest, right? On defensively against some of the guys that the Cavs have to offer. So I think that's going to be, a real key there. Guys like Andrew Nemhard and Aaron Nesmith, they're going to have to contain the perimeter guys for Cleveland. And can they do that? to a certain extent because it's not the same as what the Bucks had to offer. So there were some good regular season matchups. Again, some guys were in and out, so you still have to take it with a grain of salt. I don't know. I just think the Cavs are better, and I'm gonna go with the Cavs in 5 on this one. But I do think I think the Pacers could extend the series if they can find a way to take away some of the easy rim offense for the Cavs, because we know the Cavs offensively, that's their bread and butter. But if it just turns into 3-point shooting, like the Cavs obviously can hurt you from the perimeter, but I think they can. But I think you'll live with that if you're the Pacers. But if you're kind of giving up everything, right, and the Pacers defense is kind of just stretched to the point where there's just not a whole lot of resistance, right? That I don't know, but the Pacers have been improved on the defensive end. But this is going to be a true test for them.
Yeah, I agree, but I'm also picking Cleveland. I'm just going to pick them in probably like 6. It wouldn't surprise me if the series actually goes to 7 games. That's how high
Okay.
I think I am on Indiana. I've loved, everything that they've had to offer this season, realistically. And, coming off the Bucks series, like you said, it's a very hobbled team. They didn't have Dame, and, some of the other guys definitely didn't show up alongside, Giannis's valiant effort and whatnot. But like you said, Cleveland is definitely a different animal, and we've talked about them, throughout the entire regular season. We've loved everything that they've brought to the table and
Yeah.
everything that they do bring. You have some true star talent, in that backcourt that's just really figured everything out. It seems like it's a lot different than last year. Shout out to Kenny Atkinson for really revamping that offense. They get high volume of efficient looks, and I think that's the key. It's not so much your turn, my turn, and those guys definitely can coexist. And I think if they continue to coexist, that's going to be a really tough cover for Indiana, because you also have to worry about the double big lineup down there, with Evan Mobley and Jared Allen. Jared Allen not as much, I think, of a threat offensively as Evan Mobley, but both of those guys combined, I think, it's going to be a tough cover for Indiana. But on the flip side, you look at what Indiana has as well. Like, they're kind of equal, I think, in depth, in terms of depth pieces. Maybe you look at Cleveland's and you probably say that a little bit higher quality, but Indiana still has some guys where they can go deep in their bag, into their roster and stuff like that. So you have a guy like Siakam, who's one of the more talented all around stars. You have
Mm-hmm.
Tyrese Halliburton, who offers a lot of offensive playmaking and a lot of offensive firepower as well. That's going to have to be something that Cleveland has to work on containing. But then you look at like the swing pieces for both these teams, right? You have a guy like Max Strus. You have Ty Jerome for Cleveland. You have DeAndre Hunter. Like, I think that's going to be the key, where the depth pieces are going to be huge for Cleveland, because they're going to come in and they're practically like starters. They're like, on any other team, those guys might be starters, right? So,
Yeah.
and then in like Indiana's perspective, you're probably relying on some guys that I don't know how to describe it, because it's not like they're bad at all, right? But they're just not as good as those guys.
Yeah.
Like, I love Neesmith and Nembhard, but Nembhard's been I think a good playoff riser. However,
For sure.
I don't know, man. Like, I feel like Cleveland has the slight edge in terms of talent, and just overall, I feel like their system offensively is working. But don't
Mhm.
take Indiana lightly, because I think on both ends of the floor they definitely pose a threat.
Yeah, you know what? I think I misspoke because I think in the live stream yesterday, I think I did say Cavs in 6. So
Okay.
so I misspoke on that end. So yeah,
Yeah.
that I meant to say Cavs in 6 because
Yeah.
I don't change my picks from the live stream. Yeah, obviously
Yeah.
you can think about it and whatnot, but
Sure.
I think I misspoke on that end. So yeah, like this is I think will be a competitive series, and
Big
like
time.
you said, us picking the Cavs in 6 is not to diminish Cleveland. It's just more so to showcase like this Pacers team is very good. And I know like 6 sometimes sounds like a cop out because it's kind of just like it's a safe pick for a lot of series, right? Because it's like you're not leaning. Because if it's 7, it's like you don't really know. It's just kind of a coin flip based off a handful of factors.
Mm-hmm.
And then obviously if it's 4 or 5, then you're just like, yeah, this team is just significantly better. I guess if you're the Cavs, would you be concerned? If it goes like 6, because wouldn't that, because that would maybe suggest that like there's things that aren't going maybe as well as you thought. But the problem is with what the Pacers can do offensively. Like, we know that there could just be a game where everybody's on fire.
Right.
And that's kind of the tough part of the playoffs sometimes and it's kind of maybe sounds a little bit lazy, but just sometimes the shot variance really can kind of, make the difference in some of these games because you're going to have games where Like, yeah, a team that's heavily reliant on the outside shot, if they just completely go cold, they're probably not winning. But that's why if you're the Cavs, that's the nice thing is, because they didn't have this type of offense last year, right?
Mm-mm.
Like it was pretty much, very reliant on, the rim attacks and because they didn't have a ton of 3-point shooting, but now they have that. Because the Pacers were very dynamic last year. Where the Pacers, the strides they've made have been on the defensive end. So I think it's going to be a really fun, entertaining series. We hadn't even mentioned Halliburton because he's obviously a key figure because he's the main guy that's the driver
Yeah.
of the Pacers offense, even when he's not having high scoring offensive outbursts. He's certainly a guy that you have to pay attention to where, if you're the Cavs, who are you putting on Tyrese Halliburton in terms of limiting him? Because in that starting five, right, you don't really look at any of those guys as like a traditional, like, oh, yeah, we're good with putting him on the other team's best offensive player, right? Obviously, defense is a team effort, right? It's not necessarily just a complete one-on-one matchup, but like, I guess if assuming the starting five is the same, like you're probably looking at Max Strus, right? Kind of being the guy to maybe contain Halliburton. And then, I think you're just kind of banking on, maybe there's elements of his, one-on-one game where maybe you kind of try to force him into beating you, with his just scoring as opposed to kind of like allowing him to be able to do both. But, I don't know. That may be a tough matchup. But then because at least with the Pacers, at least you could make the case that like you have Nemhard and Neesmith, and maybe you can put one on one and the other on other. But for the Cavs, it's a little bit different. But that's also what you got the bigs for, so that way you can contain the penetration and limit the shots at the rim that we know the Pacers can do because they can attack the basket.
Yeah, I think the bigs are going to be probably the biggest, watch for me from Cleveland's perspective, right? I'm looking at Evan Mobley. I expect him, to have a coming out party, similar to what, we've been talking about, J-Dub and Chet having. So I'm looking at Evan Mobley to kind of be that guy and, show us what he can do on both ends of the floor in the playoffs and in the postseason. Because I feel like in the Miami series wasn't convincing enough for me to be like, yeah, he's ready. You know what I mean?
Hmm. Yeah, for sure. So yeah, I think that's going to be a really exciting
Yeah.
scenario
Yeah.
for sure. Then in the West, like we're still, Minnesota as of right now, Minnesota's obviously, waiting because they took care of the Lakers, but we got another game seven. And by the time that we're done with this, right, that game seven will be over. But the Rockets were able to force a game seven because I believe the last time we recorded, right, we recorded on Thursday, and I believe that was before the game six, right? And we kind of assumed, at that point, right, that okay, the Rockets are down 3-1. They got a nice win in game five where they, kind of just steamrolled Golden State, who clearly didn't take that game seriously. But then the Rockets went out and won game six, right? Which I think was definitely the one that was more surprising, more shocking. And, now it's house money for a game seven, right? So obviously, you look at that game six and what Houston was able to do. Fred VanVleet continues to play amazing basketball, right? Just after being horrendous offensively through the first three games, now all of a sudden he can't miss. He's basically playing like Steph, essentially, for the last few games. And then you kind of look around at some of the other contributions, right? Amen Thompson's been able to figure some stuff out in terms of attacking in the pick and roll and getting downhill. Alperen Şengün, right? Continuing to, again, not crazy efficient, but being super impactful on both ends of the floor because they're finding ways to, put him in spots defensively where he's able to get the job done. Obviously doing great in terms of rebounding. Now also kind of bringing the ball up as a point guard sort of sometimes offensively, especially when they're running that double big lineup. And that's kind of where the series has turned is that double big lineup, which was effective through the first three games, but they've been able to use it even more in the last few games where it's been a huge part of their dominance on the boards against Golden State and being able to get extra possessions, getting to the free throw line. They had 46 free throw attempts, still missed 13 of them, but because they got so many, right? And then that makes all the difference, right? Whereas Golden State shot 80% from the line, but only 22 attempts. So, you did a good job. And, 22 attempts is a lot of free throws, but 46 is even more, right? And then obviously defensively, right, they're playing the zone where they're kind of forcing a lot of the non-Steph and Jimmy guys into, knocking down some big shots. And that has not been the case as of late, right? Because some of these guys who shot the ball well in some of the earlier games, like Peyton, like Pajemski, like Buddy Hield and Quentin Post, they've disappeared in the last few games. Draymond Green, another guy that offensively has been, to me, in my opinion, pretty abysmal, right? I mean, he's got more turnovers than field goals made. I think 19 turnovers to 18 field goals made. We know defensively, right, he's done his job, but it's also he's been stretched out so thin because of the fact that he's got to deal with these double bigs, and it's just that's a lot to ask for a team that doesn't have a ton of size. Doesn't help that you're not really getting a ton from, your other bigs because Posta stunk. And then, Looney played like 2 minutes, right? And then, Trey Jackson Davis and Kaminga really haven't played at all, right? And Kaminga's kind of been a hot topic of discussion because of the fact that he played well against the Rockets in the regular season. But then to go into the playoffs, he really has been just a DNP. The only games he played was when Jimmy Butler was hurt. Because even in the games where Golden State was getting blown out, he wasn't in there in garbage time, right? And Kerr, he mentioned that it's 100% on the table that Kaminga plays, but in the minutes he's played, he's also just been kind of like a space cadet, where he just doesn't really look like he knows what he's doing out there. Doesn't seem like he's his mind is completely in the game, and I think that's understandable, just given the roller coaster that his role has been. I think, we both know that we're not huge fans of his game and that there are, pros and cons in terms of what he does on both ends of the floor. But you just watch them play in the last couple of games, and it just feels like they need somebody, anybody, who can just, jump over a phone book, and at least give them a little bit of contributions, either at the rim. And then obviously, like, some of these guys need to be better. Like, you need some more 3-point shooting from some of these guys. Because it can't just be Steph and Jimmy Butler, right? Like, I know they shot very poorly in this game, and game 5 everybody was poor, but the stars, that's not the biggest issue to me, because you still got a combined 56 from Steph and Jimmy Butler, but you need some of these other guys to show up. And who knows? I don't know what's going to happen in game 7, right? Because I picked the Warriors to win in 6. Because I felt like, despite the advantages that the Rockets had, I thought the Warriors could kind of leverage some of their advantages from the perimeter. And, in terms of the star power and the role players, I thought that would kind of make the difference. And again, I looked like a good pick when they went up 3-1. But I don't know. I did not like their approach in game 5, where you understand that, yeah, you got blown out. The Rockets were super desperate, but they did cut it close, and they could have put the starters back in, and they didn't do that. And then in game 6, that was kind of the point of giving away game 5, was so that way game 6 you're at home and you just close it out there. And they didn't do that. The Rockets wire to wire controlled this game. But game 7, I'm still leaning towards Golden State, because it's just, if you're Houston, you still have to bank on another Fred VanVleet masterclass. If you don't get that, then you got to hope you get some offense from Jalen Green. And credit to him, defensively, he's been good, but he's been, just not very good on the offensive end. I mean, Houston will be at home, but I don't know. Like, I just think game 7, even if it's on the road, I think Golden State has more guys you can trust, and it could just be a Steph and Jimmy backpack game. But I also can't rule out Houston could just absolutely just destroy Golden State into game 7, because they may not have much left. And, even if they get out of this series alive, you're playing every other day. You're still going to be playing against other bigger, physical, more athletic teams. But I don't know. I think at the very least, they got to find a way to stop that too big lineup. So either Looney's going to have to play more, or you're going to have to dust off, Kaminga or Looney or Santos, because that can't continue to happen.
Yeah, I think, if you picked Rockets in 7 like me, this is kind of the blueprint. Granted, I don't think anybody expected them to somewhat pull off a 3-1 comeback at this point, but especially for game 6, I do kind of want to focus on that, because that's what I think I loved, from everything from Houston's perspective, right? You had a pop-off moment with Fred VanVleet. He stepped up and was the primary scorer, which I think the team has desperately been missing. You have Şengün who can do that, but I think it's better if it comes from a different spot, and particularly from the perimeter, right? You'd either want Jalen Green or Fred VanVleet to do so, and I think you have to credit Fred VanVleet for doing this and being on a heater and being that veteran leader that I think, has stepped up
Mhm.
and taken this team, I think, to the next level on offense because they're shooting lights
Yeah.
out from the 3-point line, and it's pretty much
Come
mainly
on,
from
yeah.
him. Exactly. It's mainly him. He's taking the highest volume and he's hitting it the most efficiently, right? Um, Second part, depth pieces, right? The reason why I wanted to pick the Houston Rockets, going into the series was I just didn't. I looked at the Warriors and I just looked up and down the roster. I searched long and hard and I couldn't find
Mhm.
anybody outside of Steph and Jimmy that I thought confidently could give me a consistent third
Mhm.
option kind of vibe, right? And I think when you don't have that's a little worrisome. Not necessarily because, you don't believe in them closing games. That's not the issue. We already know that Steph and Jimmy are able to do that on a nightly basis. It's more so, collectively as a unit, stuff piles up, right? Those guys are eventually going to run out of gas. You have to look to other guys, and Houston's willing to give up those looks, right? They're willing to sag
Mhm.
off of the Gary Payton. They're willing to give him all the time in the world to shoot because he's most likely not going to knock it down. Same thing with Draymond. Pajemski, different story. I think they're probably less willing to do so, but they were willing to in games 5 and 6, right? And
Mhm.
they reap the benefits of doing so because they're going to get the rebound and they're most likely going to what? Score in transition and continue to rack up points. And I think that's the beauty of it. They found their identity offensively and defensively, right? Steph
Mhm.
doing his thing, but the Rockets defense is still bothering him on tough shots, right? Jimmy Butler,
Yeah,
I
that
think,
4th quarter
yeah,
was the difference.
exactly. And I think, from a Warriors perspective, I didn't like anything that they did in game 5 or 6. I didn't like the way that they approached the game offensively. Too many threes from Jimmy, too many threes from Draymond, too many threes from Gary Payton Jr. I don't like that. Sorry. I know that that's the result and that's the shot that you're given, but they've got to find a way to make guys pay because I think that they can win this series easily, right? If they just kind of stick to their brand of basketball, but they're not doing that, right? They're shooting threes from guys that are not trusted, well-known three-point shooters, but for Houston, the double big lineup is glowing, right?
Adam,
I thought
even
that was another key that I had mentioned going into this series was the double big lineup. I thought that it was going to be pretty spectacular and, that they were going to get almost every offensive rebound. It was just a matter of converting them because, in game 4, I think that was the last time we had talked. They weren't
Mhm.
converting anything, right? And
Right,
they,
yeah, so many missed shots around the rim in game 3, and then game 4 was the free throw game.
exactly. And it's like, yeah, the O boards look great, but if you're not converting them, it doesn't matter. Now, in game 5 and 6, they're converting them. They're getting, second chance opportunities, and they're hitting threes off of them as well, which is amazing. Depth
Mhm.
wise, shout out to Jabari Smith Jr., shout out to Tara Eason. They have been
Yeah,
playing their roles magically. They've been making something out of nothing on busted plays, and there's a lot of them, believe me. Fred Van Vliet as well. He's been making, stuff happen out of busted plays and stuff like that. So shout out to all those guys, being able to hit shots and not just,
mhm.
they're elevating and playing out of their role, which I think is special because you look at the Warriors and they don't really have that factor. And I think that's what's gonna, give the Rockets the advantage in this game 7. I'm picking Rockets in 7 still.
Yeah, according I mean, the numbers don't lie. I mean, the Rockets are outscoring the Warriors by 42.7 points per 100 possessions. And actually, we didn't even mention it, but actually, that's not from the double big. It's like that triple big lineup, right? Where it's like Şengün, Steven Adams, and then Jabari Smith Jr. is like a small forward,
Yeah.
right, or a wing or whatever. Um, that's just kind of crazy. And again, that was kind of the advantage, for if you picked Houston to win in 7, that's the advantages that you kind of talked about was like, okay, they may not have the star power, but they may be a little bit deeper and they have a lot more size and athleticism. And if the series continues to go long, right, that might be a problem. And like you said, the problem, the question that I had for Houston was the offense. But in the last few games, the offense has showed up, and honestly, for a decent chunk of the series, the 3-point shooting, has been pretty acceptable, right? Because they were not a very good 3-point shooting team, over the course of the season, right? But then when you look at, a game by game basis, right? Like the offense has gotten, I mean, they were, couldn't even crack close to 100 through the first 3 games, right? Like they, whereas in games 4, 5, and 6, they've gotten 106 or more, right? And that's kind of a key thing. Like if you're Houston and you can score, anything close to that, like that's going to keep you in the game. And then, defensively, can you hold Golden State, right? Because, that's been kind of the question. It's just tough because I think games 3 or 4, if Houston loses the series, that's kind of where you lost the series, right? Because game 3, that's the one where Butler doesn't play, right? And then Steph and some of the role players, right, show up, right, and kind of, pull off the upset. And then obviously in game 4, you limited Steph, but then everyone else was able to show up. And then, he still made some key plays late. But, in the last few games, everything has gone Houston's way. So it really comes down to game 7.
Yeah.
And then obviously the winner of this game and this series has to travel to Minnesota. Well, no, if Houston wins, it's in Houston. If Golden State wins, they have to travel to Minnesota. So, that's the tough part if you're Golden State is you got to do all of this on the road and you got to play every other night. And I just feel like at a certain point, and with Steph and Jimmy, I think, kind of a little bit limited in terms of what they can do. That's not a great scenario to be in. But, it's kind of funny how we got here, right? Because you picked the Rockets in 7 and, it could happen. Like I said, I would lean Golden State, but I would not be surprised by any outcome here, right? Yeah. And I think you got to give a ton of credit to the Rockets for, you got punched in the gut going down 3-1. You had 2 winnable games that you could not figure out, you couldn't close, and you got some pretty underwhelming performances from a number of guys, but they've turned it around, they've made adjustments, their young guys have figured some things out, and their vets have shown up, and that's been, a key piece, because even, with Udoka, we mentioned some of the things he did, that I kind of already mentioned with the Şengün piece, and finding the more effectiveness from the double bigs. But then, say a Dillon Brooks doesn't play well in game 6, is in foul trouble, just benches him and is like, we'll just play some of the other guys. We'll play Eason, we'll play Jabari Smith Jr. more. And that's, like you said, speaks to the depth, that they can, where they can do that. Whereas with Golden State, if, I don't know, say a Draymond, right? Because that's kind of their, I guess, in theory, third best. I'm not saying Dillon Brooks is their third best player, but say somebody who's not one of their 2 best players. If Draymond doesn't play well, there's not really a clear solution for that, right? Because he's not been good on offense, but he's too important defensively. Where it's if he's in the game, the offense might be kind of gunked up, but if he's not out there, they have no hope or answers defensively, right? Especially when they're gonna still be small, or the other bigs they have just can't move defensively. So I'm super excited about what happens in this game. But then I guess the question is do you think either of these teams, can, would you pick either of these teams to beat Minnesota, regardless of who comes out?
Probably not. I think, with Golden State, I think if they come out of this series, no shot, no, because I feel like Minnesota does some of the things very similar to what Houston does. They have a couple of big men that they can put out there. They have Julius Randle, who's a physical guy, and the Edwards factor as well. That guy clearly elevates in the playoffs. So it's kind of like going up against Houston with an Anthony Edwards, right? And I don't think that that the Golden State would be able to come out of that one alive because of what he brings on the offensive end. And you got guys like Jaden McDaniels, you've got, Nickeil Alexander-Walker. So, they possess some similar defensive attributes and traits that the Houston Rockets possess. And then whereas, you look at Houston versus Minnesota, that I feel like would be very interesting because both of those teams are very good defensively. They have some length. They both have size. So it would definitely be a little bit more of an old-fashioned game. It really comes down to, who's going to be better offensively because I feel like Julius Randle, that's a series where he might have to, get in his bag a little bit and make things difficult for Houston. Anthony Edwards, same thing as well. And, who's going to show up for Houston? Say they do get out of this Golden State series. All right, well, now the pressure, once again, is going to be on Jalen Green, Fred VanVleet to create on the perimeter. And Golden State's defense is so great as well. So we already saw that they've struggled with that, throughout the series. Not so much the back end of it, with Fred VanVleet. But Minnesota, I feel like they bring a different look defensively than what Golden State provides. So I feel like Minnesota would probably take it.
Yeah, and we just got some notification. So it looks like Peyton is going to be out for Game 7 with an illness, and then it looks like Garland's going to be out for Game 1.
All right.
So, yeah, so that That could potentially change some things here. Obviously, again, we won't be talking about it until the next episode. But either
Kaminga
way,
has to play
you know,
now, in my opinion.
yeah,
He has
for
to.
sure. We'll see. And but now to close it out, we do have one last thing to talk about. So Greg Popovich, right? He's retiring. Obviously, earlier in the season, he had the stroke. I think it
Yep.
was November, if I'm
I
not mistaken,
I
right? And
think
that put
so.
him out.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that put him out, the rest of the way. I think he also had a more minor one, if I'm not mistaken, right? While he was at a restaurant, I
Yeah,
think.
I believe so.
Yeah, so 76 years old. Now he's retiring. He's going to be replaced by Mitch Johnson, right? Who's the guy that was taken over for him
Interim.
over the
Yeah.
course of the season, right? The interim guy.
Yeah.
Um, record closes at 14, 22 wins, 869 losses, so 62 winning percentage, 5 titles. Obviously, all-time great coach, right? Obviously, seems like everybody loves him. Seems like a great guy. But obviously, this means a new era, a new chapter for the Spurs, right? Because you got Wemby, franchise guy. You just brought in De'Aaron Fox. You just drafted some other young guys in the last few years outside of Wemby, like Stephon Castle. Also, Vassell, who you paid, Sohan and others, right? So, and then this is also, and obviously they're going to have a lottery pick. So this is going to be, a transition time for the Spurs, right? Because now new coach, completely new team. And this team could look even more different, right? Because they might potentially get the number 1 pick if the lottery bounces their way. And then also there could be the possibility of maybe they go out and trade for a star, right? There's been talks about, maybe a guy like a Giannis, or, people have also mentioned, I think, Durant and some others. So there's certainly the potential, for this team to look very different by the time, next season starts. But obviously a lot of it starts, with Popovich. Obviously also had a lot of talent around him as well, right? But, obviously he's going to be moving into the advisory role. So, shout out to him for a great coaching career.
Yeah, shout out to Pop. He's definitely one of the, iconic basketball coaches in the NBA, and honestly one of the iconic coaches in all of sports history, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even like on and off the court, the tales are very well documented. No need to really
Yeah.
go through them. Everybody knows them, right?
Everybody's given a story about, things that he did, or, awesome things that he said to them.
Exactly. And look at the guys who he's coached. I think their character speaks a lot to, what the what kind of coach he is, because I think sometimes, teams are a direct reflection of, what the coach is as a person, basketball and not, right? And I think, with this, new guy coming in, it's going to be a line of succession, right? I think the culture is set, I think, for the Spurs for probably, the next 50 years, right? I think that's how deeply rooted, Popovich was within the organization, and still is, clearly, right? But I think system wise, you might see some things shake up. We might see, them modernize it a little bit. Obviously, we already know what Wemby can do. But, I think changes are going to be inbound in terms of, how they look on the court. And like you said, I think the lottery pick could potentially change some things up. And I would prefer them, go out and get that star and accelerate, the timeline, considering we don't know what Wemby's long-term health is going to look like, right? So I think you need to take advantage of that window as well. But overall, I think the Spurs organization, you can really only go up from here. And I think it's a good thing. It's not like a horrible kind of, retiring, or, you're not going out on a low note, right? I feel like it's a good thing.
Well, I mean, the health factor is kind of the tough one.
Well, yeah, but I'm talking about
Yeah.
the
Right.
the transition
The, like,
period. Like you're not hiring an idiot. You're not, going outside. No, I'm serious. Like you're not hiring an idiot, and you're not doing, stupid things. They're handling this the right way. So I don't think, people are pissed about, the line of succession and,
Right.
Any changes that are incoming.
Yeah, and like this season, it was kind of hard at times to evaluate completely what was going on anyways, because of all of that, right? Because of, obviously, you had the Pop situation, and then Mitch Johnson takes over. But then obviously the latter part of the season, you make a big move where you get De'Aaron Fox, and then, him and Wemby get like what? less than 10 games together before Wemby's season is done with the blood clots.
Hmm.
And then obviously Fox's season is done because they know and understand, we can tank and we can get, some, put some lottery luck and, keep him healthy long term, right? Because those are franchise pieces that they brought in. So we'll see. Like I said, I think, was there things that you maybe saw before that, maybe that you liked from Johnson? Because, again, it was kind of a small sample size, you know?
Yeah, very small sample size. I mean, rotational stuff I think was fine. I think I do kind of like them kind of trying to figure out who's, going to be kept and who's not. I feel like that's kind of what ultimately what the end of the season was. It's not like, they kind of just threw it away. It was, it was very tactical, right? Is Keldon Johnson a long-term piece, right? What the heck does Sohan look like, experimental wise? Like what position can we put him at? What kind of role does he have? Is he going to be, a long-term starter? Is he going to come off the bench? Things like that. So, I feel like there's remnants of that, stretch where they were really bad trying to get, that number one pick for Wemby still on the team that I think you do have to kind of root out and weed out and figure out if you can kind of develop those guys still, or, maybe we just dump the investment and, kind of just build around what we have, because we have a great core of, guys like Vassell, you have De'Aaron Fox and Wemby, obviously. So I feel like that's good, but there are some things where I think they need to kind of get those things taken care of. And that's what the end of the season was for, right? To see if those guys are legit or not.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to look at it. Well, now we're gonna close it out, and we're gonna look at just a comment from one of our last shorts. This is from the Minnesota beats Lakers in 5 short, right? So this was after they got eliminated, and from Martin Mascarenas, 8-4-12. They need a center. He's talking about they're talking about the Lakers right after they lost to Minnesota, and yeah, they need one badly.
Yeah, that's for sure. I think everybody's been talking about that. That's really been talk of the town, since Luka was even acquired, and that's why they went out and tried to get Mark Williams, and that ultimately blew up in their face. But I think they'll find a way to address that in the offseason.
Yeah, we'll see. Who they end up kind of putting in there, right? Obviously we talked about maybe the type of center that you'd like to see it be, but certainly one that can protect the rim, that can rebound, run the floor. I'm curious if they consider a stretch or not, but again, like how many guys can do all of that? Like how many guys can stretch the floor, rebound, rim run, block shot? Like there's not that many type of bigs, so you may have to kind of settle for one or the other, but we'll see what they're able to pull off in the summer.
Yes, sir.
And then our last poll from IG, will Minnesota win against their next matchup? This was also tied into that last Wolves-Lakers short, and it was 50-50. So according to the responses, they were 50-50 about whether or not they're going to, have success against the next matchup. Obviously, it's either Houston or Golden State, depending on what happens with this Game 7.
Yeah, I'm assuming a lot of people are picking Golden State to win, the Game 7 tonight or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So I would assume they're also picking Golden State to beat Minnesota, which is interesting because I don't know. Maybe I'm just tripping, but I just don't think that that's going to be possible.
Yeah, it comes down to a lot of different factors. It's going to continue to come down to the supporting cast and the role players. Again, Minnesota offers different challenges from Houston, because they, obviously they have a superstar, but then obviously like some of the bigs they have are different from Houston's bigs, right? Like Houston doesn't have like a Naz Reid stretch 5, right? But then also like they also don't have like a Rudy Gobert, but then like Adams and Şengün pose different problems, right? Like Minnesota doesn't have the same post presence, but they have a lot more perimeter shooting that you would feel like might be a little bit more consistent. And then their guards outside of Edwards aren't, I don't know, they're a little bit different, but I could see somebody like picking Golden State to win the series. I just think like it's going to be still a tall task to continue to, bank on Steph and Jimmy and then hope and pray that some of the other role players show up.
Yeah.
Well, that's it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, let us know your thoughts on, all these potential, all these eliminations and matchups, because the second round is getting ready to start. By the time we record, we're going to have multiple second round matchups to talk about. Let us know your thoughts on Pop. And then also just let us know, your thoughts on our content, because obviously we read the comments. So if you leave a comment, we'll read it at the end of the video. Obviously, you can go on Instagram and check out our socials and look at, these questions that we put out and join, and that way we can kind of go over it and talk about it and discuss it, and continue to like and subscribe so that way our channel can grow. So we appreciate all the support. We'll see you next episode.